So the director of BU Cares had been at a meeting with superintendents and had talked to the superintendent of Southwest Horizon School Division. And they had talked about finding the sticky bits. And when Michelle Lamb, the director of BU Cares, when she asked me if I'd be interested in the project, she said, that's what she called it. She said, they're interested in finding the sticky bits from remote learning in the spring. I think in the beginning I was asking myself the question, why sticky bits? It was a really hard time. And it's important to find the good and to find what positive came out of it. And I think those are the sticky bits. As I was reading through and looking for quotations that might go along with that sentiment, I read one by Henry Ford, and I might not get his quotation right, but it was basically about how the plane has to go into the wind to take off rather than going with the wind. And I sort of think that that's what this research has been about. What happened when teachers had to fly into the wind? And I think these are some of the practices that took off. I think the first obvious one is technology. During the pandemic, teachers learned more about the technology than they've been able to learn in the last 10 years. So what did they learn about technology? I heard some cool stories about how they were using technology in their classrooms to build independence. One teacher talked to me about using Google Classroom as a tool in her Facetoface class, in a split grade classroom, to build independence in one group while she worked in the other group. Someone else talked to me about using Flipgrid to give video feedback and to get video feedback from students, that it was way faster when they were marking, and that students were actually listening to the videos or watching the videos and responding in video. For a long time as a researcher and as a teacher leader, as an administrator in a school, I focused on trying to teach teachers to use technology in their classrooms. And the pandemic was able to do that much more effectively and really quickly. I think one of the most interesting findings to come out of this study, and it was pretty consistent across the people that I interviewed, they talked about how they had to learn to focus their lessons and to be really concise, but to be really precise. I think maybe the most clear description of that was a teacher who was teaching kindergarten, and she was getting 15 to 20 minutes on the phone with each of her students each day. And then if she wasn't really careful about the language that she was using, it was really going over their heads. At the end, when I asked what they had changed, one teacher put it really clearly, and she said that she had restructured her whole day sort of around the idea of being more focused and being more direct. And what she found as a result was that students in her class were flourishing, was her word. I think every person that we talked to talked about how assessment was one of the things that they had learned about during the pandemic. I think it's connected to that time piece, and that teachers didn't have as much time and they felt distant from their students. And so I think they were doing more regular assessment. There was one teacher who said that she had really changed her assessment practices, and that her record keeping had become much more organized and much more thorough. So assessment during remote teaching became more formal. I think the next one is about the importance of teachers paying attention to students' social emotional wellness or mental health. Almost every person that I interviewed talked about this to some extent. The first one was a middle years teacher, and he talked a lot about the importance of building community and having his students still belong to that community. And in fact, one of the things that he was saying was that students aren't getting up at 9 o'clock in the morning to come to Zoom and talk about problem solving. But students are getting up and coming to Zoom at 9 o'clock in the morning because they care about the community that they belong to. And if the community is doing exciting things, they want to be a part of it. And I thought that was interesting that he had sort of shifted that whole idea, of keeping routines because that's healthy for them, but also shifting the idea of rather than just focusing on learning, focusing on making sure that he was being empathetic and making sure that he was talking about important things with them. There was another one that I think was important. I talked to a high school teacher who was sort of doing the same thing. She talked about the importance of routine, and then her routine in the morning was to have them come in and do both an academic check-in and a mental wellness check-in. And she said that she was surprised with the mental wellness check-in that, she'd pose the question just to start the discussion, and that she anticipated some people would talk because some people were more engaged. But she was really surprised with some of the statements that came from students that didn't talk as often, and that she was able to learn things and figure out how she needed to support them and then go back to them and make sure that they were getting the support that they needed. And so I think that will carry on. I think at least for those teachers who had that learning, but potentially that changes culture as well. And we understand that social emotional is an important part of learning. We need to try to create ubiquitous learning opportunities. And when I say that, what I mean is that we need to make learning materials and learning resources available to students, accessible to students, accessible to parents. And so during remote teaching, students were learning in such different situations or contexts from each other. Some of them had technology, some of them didn't have technology, some of them had technology that was working. Some of them were coming to class, some of them weren't coming to class. And teachers started creating their materials in several different media. So they were sending it out by email, they were putting it on Google Classroom, they were recording it, they were teaching a lesson live synchronously online on Zoom. And what they learned was that different students were picking up from different places, and that when they were putting it out in many different forms and different formats, that more people were able to engage with the material. One other thing that came out of remote learning or remote teaching was the need to collaborate with colleagues. I think actually 4 people used the term or the phrase all in the same boat, and that it felt so good when they got to talk to other teachers and find out that we were all in the same boat. There were a few ways that people thought about that. So for some people, the online grade groups were really helpful. And they made suggestions, at least 2 people made suggestions, that it would be good to carry on with those online grade groups even during face-to-face teaching, because they were learning so much. It gave teachers who were isolated in small rural communities, it gave them a place to collaborate with colleagues who worked in the same area as they did. And that was really powerful for some of them. Somebody else talked about some of the online support that they were getting from teachers in some of the social media groups that they were a part of. And I thought that was interesting as well, that even reaching out to teachers across the world, that teacher collaboration part was really important. And I think we saw that come together. I think the other thing that was really important to hold on to was the idea that we all need to find some balance in our lives. I think that was a really important piece for teachers. They found different ways. Partly it's about self-care and partly it's about mental wellness, but they often talked about just shutting down, like that they just had to find times. They had to find times that they just scheduled to do other things, that they had to close the door and leave their technology and go and walk the dog. They also looked at balance from the perspective of education, and that they needed to create balance for their students. So they were aware of how much time their students were spending online and how many tasks they were asking their students to do. But I think it was important that they were all looking at, how do we create healthy balance for teachers, for ourselves, for our students, for our families. And I hope that's something that will stick. I think another thing that is resoundingly in the data, and not a surprise to anyone, but I think every participant in the study talked about how much they appreciated being back in the classroom with their students. That face-to-face learning, hands-on learning was really important, and that they missed having that personal closeness. It kind of made my heart feel good to learn how much teachers just missed being in their classrooms teaching. Throughout the pandemic, I've worried a lot about teachers. I think they've had one of the hardest roles in our society. While many of us were able to stay at home, they were asked to go to work for most of the time. They had periods of remote learning, but mostly they were in classrooms, face-to-face. And yet, I think teachers were overlooked as frontline workers. I think they didn't get the credit that people that were working in other, even in grocery stores. I think we didn't give teachers the credit for the way that they were exposing themselves to the pandemic every day. But teachers are amazing. And what they talked about wasn't that. They didn't talk about that. They talked about the things that they had learned. And they talked about how they kept students safe and how they kept students going and how they worked really hard to focus their lessons so that students got the most out of short lessons that they could get. And they worked in situations where sometimes, there were several of them that talked about having their classes split between 2 rooms. And I think if we go back to what Henry Ford said, they tried to fly into the wind. And I think we see lots of pieces coming out that actually became a time of learning for them. And they actually grew. And I think they'll actually have pieces to take away that they'll make the best of this really challenging period in our history.